We have a ton of former pastors that are a part of our family here at Foundation. And today you have the opportunity to hear from one of them. And I'm excited to sit back and listen because he is one of my favorite communicators that I've ever heard share Scripture with us. The coolest part, though, about this individual is, to me, is how he leads his family. Just how he leads his family. He's incredible in leading and serving. One of the favorite things that I get to do is serve the community with his family. And one of the coolest things that I've seen this week on social media was a picture of his wife and two of his three boys at one of our community partners serving in the community. And in serving in the community for an opportunity that I didn't set up, I just got the opportunity to sit at my desk and scroll through and go, man, this family understands what it means to love their city and to love people with their time and with their effort and their energy. Michael Gunnan is going to be leading us this morning. Michael is the Chief Growth Officer, I think I got that right, at Walk Through the Bible. And Walk Through the Bible is a ministry that places premium emphasis on helping people engage with the Bible and lead through living through the Bible on a daily basis all over the world. So give it up for Michael. We are excited that you're here. Thank you, Michael Gunnan.
Thank you, Jason, for those two kind words. It is certainly a joy to open up God's Word with you this morning. Listen, I believe that this book that God wrote has the power to transform our lives. And so I approach the study of and the teaching of His Word with great anticipation that God would use His book to stir change in us. And it is a joy to seek that together with you this morning. My youngest son, Dylan, if you know Dylan, well, there's a whole nother conversation. When Dylan was young, he discovered that he loved to eat those little frozen fish sticks. You know the ones that I'm talking about that may or may not actually be fish. For many days at lunch, a lot of days, most days for lunch, he ate those little fish sticks. And maybe because we have a house of three boys and it's always a little chaotic and everybody is always looking for something to eat, we decided, or we discovered somehow, that he would eat those little frozen fish sticks if they were warmed up not in the toaster oven, how you're supposed to do it, but in the microwave. And that is disgusting. And so in a minute, we could have, a steaming pile of fish-like substance warmed up on a plate. And the efficiency of that was spectacular. When Dylan started preschool at a little church preschool near our house, and it was time to pack his lunch, can you guess what he wanted to take for lunch in pre-K? Fish sticks. And so we would microwave fish sticks at about 6:30 in the morning. And trust me, the smell of microwave fish sticks is not how you want to start your day. We'd microwave the fish sticks. We would put them in a little piece of Tupperware. We'd put the lid on the piece of Tupperware. We'd stick it in his backpack, and we would send him off to school. I cannot imagine the trauma that was released into that classroom when poor Dylan opened that lid of Tupperware. But he kept asking for them, and we kept sending them, and we probably owe some teachers a sincere apology. I remember on occasion thinking, what must his teachers think of us as parents? If their only evaluation of us as parents was that we were the crazy ones who sent microwaved fish sticks to school, what in the world could they possibly conclude about us? Now, it is interesting to think, isn't it? If teachers evaluated the parents of their students based only on what those parents sent to school in their kids' lunchbox. Not talking about food specifically, there is a similar question that our text asks of us this morning? Based solely on what you consume in your life, what might people say about you? If people only saw the inputs that you allow into your life, what might others around you conclude? What would they say about your life, about your priorities, about your passions, about your convictions? If people only knew you based on what you consume, what would they conclude about the priority that you have placed on the beatitude in front of us this morning? Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. As Jason hinted at, we are in a message series as a church entitled Intro to Jesus, in which we are studying through a series of statements known as the Beatitudes that are found at the beginning of a sermon that Jesus delivered known as the Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Beatitude comes from the Latin word which means blessed, because each of these statements begins with the word blessed. Blessed are the pure in heart. If we rewind the tape just a minute in Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, we're told this. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." In Matthew's gospel, this begins Jesus' public ministry. This begins the announcement of Jesus starting this public ministry in Matthew's gospel. And so the crowds gather around him, and then he begins this sermon in Matthew 5, the first sort of public teaching that Jesus does. And he begins very intentionally saying something like this: I have come to announce the kingdom, my kingdom, and if you want to come and be a part of my kingdom, then this is a picture, a snapshot of the life that you will live. The Beatitudes are not so much a list of imperatives for us to follow as they are a picture of what the person will look like who has authentically entered into Jesus' kingdom. They will be poor in spirit. They will mourn. They will be meek. They will hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be merciful. And we then arrive at the sixth of these blessed statements. The one that I'd argue is probably the hardest. Well-timed vacation, Clint. Blessed is the pure in heart, for they will see God. I want to make two observations this morning that I think will help us to both understand what does Jesus mean by this statement and then apply what that is to our lives from this single verse. In order to do so, however, we're going to have to widen the lens just a little bit into Matthew's gospel. The first observation that I would make is this: that a pure heart for Jesus, as he stands and delivers this message, a pure heart is more than religious observance. It's more than religious observance. See, we need to understand first what Jesus means by heart. In our contemporary language, if we were to say heart, we would generally think that it is the seat of our emotions, right? You draw a heart, it conjures up images of love and affection, right? Heart is an emotional thing for us. In the New Testament specifically, really throughout the entire Bible, and especially in Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Matthew, the heart is more than just the seat of our emotions. It is the center of a person's being. It is the spring from which all life flows out of. Let me highlight that for you in Matthew's gospel. Matthew chapter 15, verse 17 through 19. The words will be here on the screen. Jesus says, "Do you not see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body?" Like Biology 101 with Jesus this morning. "But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander." The heart, you see the heart is the center from which all of that impurity gives birth to sin. So when Jesus says heart, blessed are the pure in heart, he's not talking about your emotional state. He's talking about that place from within us from which all of our life emerges and all of our behavior begins. Matthew chapter 12, verse 34. "For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." Your heart is full of goodness and compassion and kindness, and your words will be full of goodness and compassion and kindness. If your heart is full of filth and dirt and impurity, then the words that are going to come out will not sound the same. The blessed life, Jesus says, is the one with a pure heart, that place from which everything emerges out of is pure. Which then begs the question, well, what does it mean for that place to be pure? Well, in his graciousness to us, Jesus does not leave us to figure that out on our own. And in fact, the rest of the sermon, so Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, the Beatitudes are the introduction, the beginning, the setting the stage. This is a picture of what a blessed life will look like. Everything that follows in the rest of the sermon is an explanation or an exposition of what that pure, blessed life should look like. And for Jesus, since the heart is the source from which all life flows out of, a pure heart is more than just simply keeping the right religious rules. It's more than that. Shortly after the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins one of the most difficult sections in the sermon. Let me highlight that for you. If you've got a Bible, Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, Jesus says this: "You have heard it said to people long ago, 'You shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." I mean, goodness, that's a staggering statement, isn't it? So for Jesus, you see what the pure heart is not just about keeping the law, not just about observing the command, but it's also the thoughts and the intentions and the motives that reside within our hearts. Here's another example of Jesus communicating this. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. See that in your Bibles. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Let the weight of that in our modern sexually driven society sink in. A pure heart in the mind of Jesus is not just the one that abstains from the big obvious sins, but rather in the mind of Jesus, a pure heart is one that is free from impure thoughts, impure desires, impure impulses, and lust. I mean, we could go really on through the rest of the sermon, but I hope those two illustrate the point. When Jesus says blessed are the pure in heart, he's not talking about just blessed are those who keep all of the right rules. He's saying no. A pure heart is more than just rule keeping. A pure heart is more than just religious observance. In fact, one of the most frightening things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount comes at the very end. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus is ending the sermon. This is a hard conclusion to a sermon. He says this, Matthew 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And then listen to this, many. And that word many ought to rattle us this morning. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. I mean, what a staggering statement that is. Jesus says at the end of time, when everyone comes and stands before the judgment seat of Christ, there's going to be a lot of people that come up and say, Jesus, look at all the good, right, external, outward religious stuff we did. By the way, Jesus, we did it in your name. And Jesus says, but I didn't know you. And then he calls them something. Did you catch what he called them? Away from me, you evil doers. The use of evildoers is intentional there. It's a word that implies that though externally everything looked good, the heart, the inside, the internal was full of impurity and evil. Do you see how Jesus defines a pure heart? It's more than just external religious observances. So here's my question. If Jesus says things like this, hey, it's really good that you haven't murdered anybody. Like that's a positive thing. But if we have anger in our hearts, then we have the same guilt as if we had murdered someone. If Jesus says, like, okay, it's a really good thing that you haven't committed adultery. However, that seemingly innocent lingering glance means that you have committed adultery in your heart. If Jesus says there's going to be a lot of people, many, who get to the end of the age and go, God, I did a lot of things for you, and yet Jesus says your heart was so full of impurity, I didn't know you. Here's my question. If that is true, then don't you think this pure of heart business matters a lot to God? This pure heart stuff is not like for the super religious people, like only the really, really religious people worry about purity today. This truly is like intro to Jesus stuff. This is like stop everything and give attention to the condition of our hearts. And yet I can't help but fear that in our Western American modern church, we have either gotten too lazy or too casual as it relates to the care of our hearts. We applaud the walls that we set up around us to keep us from doing the big, external, obvious sins. But have we let down our guard? And there's places in which impurity can come in. There's a story that comes from the early 1900s. It has been told, and there's various versions of it that exist, so it's probably slightly apocryphal, but I think it will illustrate a point for just a minute. It's a story about the company General Electric, who had massive generators that kept the business going, and they were facing some massive, significant problems with one of the generators in a facility in New York, and the GE engineers couldn't, no matter how hard they tried, seem to identify the problem that was the cause of the problem that was facing this large, massive generator in their world. And so the story goes, again, maybe apocryphal at this point, but the story goes that GE called in a famed engineer by the name of Charles Steinmetz. They brought him in, and Steinmetz spent some time working alone with this big, massive generator in the early 1900s. You can imagine the size of the machines. After some time working by himself, Steinmetz left the facility in New York, and the engineers of GE went in, and they saw that he had taken a piece of chalk, and he had drawn an X on a very small single component of this big, massive machine. And the engineers then did discover that he, in fact, correctly identified the cause of the problem that they could not find themselves. So, Charles Steinmetz, a few weeks later, sent GE an invoice for $10,000. Shocked by the price, GE sent a letter to Steinmetz asking him if he would send an itemized invoice. Steinmetz did. And the itemized invoice allegedly read something like this: 1 chalk check mark, $1. Knowing where to put the check mark, $9,999. Because he cares so deeply about the condition of our hearts, my guess is that Jesus wants to put a check mark somewhere in each of our hearts this morning to help us identify where impurity has made its way in. Where might that be for you? Where might it be that externally, on the outside, outwardly, everything looks really, really, really good? We're keeping all the laws and the rules and the commands that we're supposed to do, and we're not doing the things we're not supposed to do. And externally, everything looks good. But this morning, where might Jesus be stirring something in your heart to look inward and see thoughts, see motives, see ideas, see feelings or intentions or prejudices or longings or lust or greed or anger or desires or pride that is not welcome in a pure heart? Do you see the point Jesus makes here in the Sermon on the Mount? That pure heart, it's more than just religious observance. It's something deeper than that. Which then leads me to the second of these two observations, and that is this, that a pure heart demands intentional focus. A pure heart demands intentional focus. A few years ago, my family saw me do something that I always remember doing. Like, as I play my life back, I always remember doing this. And for some reason, my family had never seen me do this. And on this particular Saturday morning, it caught their attention and now prompts their relentless ridicule. I was in the kitchen. The boys were there in the kitchen with me, and Molly, I think, was sitting in the living room. And I had poured a bowl of cereal. And I poured the bowl of cereal the way that I always do, and the way that I suspect everyone does. I poured the cereal into the bowl, and I took my finger and I had hollowed out in the middle of the bowl of dry cereal a place in which you can and should pour the milk. Because how else would you know where to pour the milk if there was not a hole in the middle of your cereal? My children saw this, and they were both appalled and confused. And though they questioned, what on earth are you doing? I tried to make a case that this is how everyone pours cereal. There has to be a place for the milk to go. And so after some debate within our home, we did the most natural thing for us to do. We turned to Facebook. This kind, servant-hearted wife that Jason spoke about this morning posted this message on Facebook. We need help settling a dispute. Michael, tagging me, says that everyone makes a hole with their finger in the middle of the cereal in which to pour the milk. I say that's ridiculous. What do you think? To my utter surprise, the comments began something like this. I've never heard of anyone doing that. I'm with Molly. That's crazy. Never heard of that. I agree with Molly. And then these kinds of things like Camp Molly, Team Molly. Like this was, some of the comments were hurtful. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. As much as I would like to take a man's side on any argument, I have to say that is crazy. At one point, trying to plead my case, I asked in the comment thread on her post, "But how do you know where to pour the milk?" To which Molly immediately replied, "I know because I'm not an idiot." Listen, the number of likes that comment got was just hurtful. As all of that was simmering down, Molly added one sort of final comment. "Michael just said that he's really surprised that nobody else does it. Oh my." In full disclosure, yesterday morning as I was sitting at my desk in my home office preparing this talk, I ate a bowl of Frosted Flakes, and before I poured my milk in my Frosted Flakes, I still do, make a hole in the middle of the cereal, because where else are you going to know how to pour the milk? Now listen, here's my point. We all have like these patterns that just, like, we don't think about them. Like they're just things we do, right? They're just patterns of behavior that are mindless for us. They're just the things that we do without really giving it any thought whatsoever. And most of those are rather innocent kinds of behaviors. But here's my point. As I've been thinking and meditating on the Sermon on the Mount in light of Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart," I am struck by a need for intentionality in this business of a pure heart. A pure heart demands intentional focus. A pure heart requires of us simply to pay attention. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, a verse that may be familiar to you, says this: "Above all else, guard your heart." And then notice the second half of that verse, which is everything we've been saying thus far. "For everything you do," what? "Flows from it." And so if Jesus says things like this, I don't want you to be a murderer, but also I don't want inside for you to harbor hate and anger. If Jesus says externally, I don't want you to commit adultery, but I also need you to really focus on avoiding those seemingly innocent, lustful glances. And you can just like insert any sort of moral behavior. And Jesus says, as much as I am concerned about you not doing that stuff externally, I am concerned about what's happening internally. That requires an active guarding of our hearts. And most of that comes down to, what do we allow in? How thoughtful, how intentional are we guarding our hearts? I mean, let's be practical for a second. Let's just use some real life examples. Think for just a second about the media that we consume. Like for instance, like you could say, what about the stuff that we watch? TV, movies, Netflix, YouTube, and on it goes. If we were to take the expectations of Jesus as it relates to a pure heart, and we were to lay it across as a filter what we allow to come into our hearts through our eyes and through our ears, would there be a conflict? No, I'm not telling you what to watch. I'm not saying watch this, don't watch this. None of that. I'm just asking a question. Like, if you think about the demands that Jesus has for a pure heart in the Sermon on the Mount, and you lay that across as a filter, what we allow to come in through our eyes and through our ears, is there tension? We could think about social media. I know I'm guilty, right? Just like we have our phones and we just sort of mindlessly scroll through social media platforms. But what if we ask, like, how might that be polluting our hearts while we're not even paying attention and we're just mindlessly scrolling? I don't think the developers of social media platforms are all that focused on helping you guard your heart. In fact, probably just the opposite. I mean, could it be that we're asleep at the wheel and the evil one is using mindless entertainment to pollute our hearts? And I'm not saying like get off social media. I'm just asking, are we intentional about guarding our hearts as we do it? Think about situations that we put ourselves in, like conversations that we have with coworkers or students in the room, conversations you have with classmates, conversations that may be seasoned with inappropriateness, that cause our minds to wander. Are we thoughtful, intentional about guarding our hearts in those moments? Listen, I cannot, nor is it my intention in any way to answer all of the questions that could be raised on those kinds of issues as Christ followers of what we should do and not do in this world. That's another sermon series, right? That's a complex series of questions. I have a single goal, and that is this: to allow God's word in Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, remind us that Jesus' demands of a pure heart necessitate that we be both intentional and thoughtful about how we are guarding our hearts. Pure hearts require intentional focus. And if we think that we can just coast through life and live a beatitude life that Jesus offers with a pure heart, given all of the inputs that come at us in this life, we have fooled ourselves. Where might God be prompting you to give some intentional focus? To stop the mindless scrolling and surfing and flipping through life and question how this world in which we live is trying and working to pollute your hearts. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. You know, this beatitude in Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, it ends with a beautiful promise, doesn't it? For they will see God. All week, as I've thought through this verse in Matthew 5:8 and focusing our attention on it, I have felt a tension. And the tension is this. The tension centers around the word for. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Because it's possible to misunderstand or to misapply what Jesus means, to turn it into a formula. If I'm pure enough, then I will see God. Or I'm going to be pure so that I can see God. And that's not what Jesus is saying. Like, I want to elevate the demands and the dangers we find here in Matthew about a pure heart, but I want to be super, super very careful to make sure that you are aware that your purity alone does not qualify you or disqualify you to enjoy an eternal place in the kingdom of heaven. Because the truth is, we have not been pure enough. The truth is, we cannot remain pure enough to fully defeat the presence of sin in our lives. And so God, through Jesus Christ, came to rescue our hearts. Our desire for a pure heart, Our desire for a pure heart should not be in any way to earn God's forgiveness, but rather our desire for a pure heart should be in response to the fact that Jesus took on our impurities on the cross in indescribable suffering, so that this morning he could look at your life and he could declare pure. He could declare forgiven, declare complete, washed, cleansed, pure. And that's the tension that we face. In this reality that through the cross we have been made right, we have been made pure, we have been cleansed. And the reality that we are still working that out every moment, every day, this side of heaven. Blessed are the pure in heart, for what? They will see God.